Chapter 2171. After Qin finished speaking, Cher's eyes fell on Yimuyun. After a long time, she said in a hoarse voice, Song Karen will take care of him from now on. Qin was stunned for a moment, and then she immediately said, Brother and Song Karen haven't reached that step yet. He hasn't brought Song Karen home. She continued, he has waited for 8 years. I don't think he has given up yet. They were so frank, and Cher's heart also became a little gloomy. 8 years was not a pleasant topic to talk about. She didn't hate Qin, not at all. How could she blame a little girl who knew nothing? Besides, no matter how precious love was, it was not as precious as life. She was Yimuyun's sister. She had been the same as her sister at the beginning. She would not watch her get hurt. Even if she was the one who got hurt in the end. She didn't blame anyone. She just wanted to live a peaceful life. She just wanted to be able to calmly say long time no see to her old friends when she set foot on the land of B City one day. Cher remembered the kiss mark on Song Karen's neck that day and smiled bitterly. Mumu, in fact, sometimes, people will be lonely. Yimuyun was the same. He had Song Karen, and it was only natural that something happened between them. Qin frowned. She always felt that she and Cher were not on the same channel. It seemed that no matter what she said, Cher would not be moved. Didn't the book say that the trick of self-injury was the best way to move a woman's heart? Cher must still have feelings for her brother. Why was Cher so determined to go back to the United States even though she had said so miserably? Qin had no other way for the time being, so she pursed her lips and did not say anything. In the distance, Zhou Chongguang looked at Qin and Cher and watched his little wife saying something. He naturally knew what she was up to. It was nothing more than to make Yimuyun and Tang Cher reconcile. In fact, he was no longer an obstacle between them. Yimuyun also knew this. People change. In Zhou Chongguang's world, there was no such thing as pure hatred. He began to live in the secular world, but it didn't mean that he had given up everything. Rather, he had learned to compromise and learn the way that was most beneficial to him. Just like between him and Qin, only when Yimuyun and Tang Cher reconciled, Qin might let go of her hatred towards him. Yes, she hated him. Although she didn't show it, he could feel it. At this moment, he looked at his little wife's helpless expression and felt that she was very cute. Zhou Chongguang smiled, stepped forward, grabbed Qin's hand, and said to Cher, I'll take Mumu back to the room first. She will have a headache if she stays in the sea breeze for a long time. Qin struggled and looked at Cher for help. Don't you want them to reconcile? Do you think they will have a chance to reconcile if you stand here like a third wheel? Zhou Chongguang chuckled and pulled her away when she was stunned. When Cher was about to leave, Yimuyun came over and said, What? Don't you want to say a word to me? She stopped and turned to look at him. I'm afraid that Miss Song will misunderstand. She won't. Yimuyun's voice was very calm. We are brother and sister. His words were almost shameless. Cher glared at him. You can do it, but I can't. Chapter 2172. If this can satisfy your vanity, Cher murmured, Yimuyun, don't flirt with others when you're with her. You should have seen Zhou Chongguang and Qin as examples. With that said, she raised her eyes and stared at him. After this reality show ends, I will return to America. Yimuyun suddenly said, Zhou Chongguang told me that you'll be participating in the show, so I came. His words surprised her a little. Did he mean that he and Zhou Chongguang had reconciled? Otherwise, why do you think I'd come to participate in such a lousy show? Yimuyun's gaze was deep as he stared into her eyes. Also, don't mention Song Karen in the future. We've broken up. Speaking of this, he was reminded of that night when she had sent Song Karen to his apartment, and he was a little annoyed. And the young lady who had infuriated him was right in front of him. He reached out and grabbed her, and she fell into his arms. Yimuyun. She cried out in surprise. Her small hands became small fists as she punched him. Yimuyun pressed her against him forcefully, letting her do whatever she wanted. After 8 years, his body had become a lot stronger. He was no longer that handsome young man, but a strong man. The sea breeze was very cold, and his body was too hot. Cher was in a world of ice and fire. She punched him continuously and said, You've already broken up with her. Why are you still touching her? Touching her? Yimuyun frowned. Which eye of yours saw which hand of mine touched her? Cher was still fooling around, and he held her hand with one hand. Tang Cher, speak clearly. His handsome face was grim. That night, you were the one who sent her to my apartment. Are you jealous now? HM? Her little hand was caught by him. He held it too tightly. She felt a little pain, but she couldn't break free. I didn't touch her, not even a finger. He emphasized, staring into her eyes. Who told you that I touched her? Cher was a little pretentious. There was nothing between them, and she had no right to comment on his private life. She had to admit that she was jealous and uncomfortable, but she couldn't say it. She didn't say anything. Yi Muyun's expression became even more unsightly. She told you? No, she could only say weakly. Yi Muyun stared at her sharply, confirming that it was Song Karen who said it. He stared at her for a long time before coldly saying, "Idiot." With that, he pulled her into his arms and kissed her angrily. He didn't give her the slightest chance to struggle. He directly locked her arms and held her in his arms as if he was holding a little doll. He kissed her deeply. Her little head kept tilting back, almost breaking in half. And he kept moving forward, holding her little head with one hand, not giving her a chance to move, and just like that, the kiss became even deeper, so much so that it made one's hair stand on end. She finally couldn't take it anymore, shaking her little head and moaning. But he was kissing her so passionately and intoxicated. He had missed her for so long in this kiss, so how could he bear to let go of her? When he finally let go of her, she could barely stand. She collapsed in his arms, panting violently. Yi Muyun's fingers stroked her little mouth gently, and his entire heart felt like it was about to jump out. Chapter 2173. Only in front of her would he have such a passionate reaction. He even wanted to pick her up and have her. Then, he carried her horizontally and walked towards his room. Meanwhile, the cameraman of the production team secretly aimed at them. He returned to the hotel room as fast as he could. The door was locked, and she was kissed behind the door. The man who had endured for 8 years could not be rejected. Even when she cried and begged him not to, he did not let her go. From the beginning to the end, Cher did not know how it happened. She only knew that he kissed her, and her head was dizzy. Then, behind the door of the suite, something that should not have happened. After 8 years, that feeling was stronger than before. She did not know whether it was because he was getting older or because he had more experience. Anyway, it was completely different from 8 years ago. She blossomed in his arms and felt that she had finally become a woman. He took her to the storm, and they drifted on a small boat. Unable to find the shore, she could only hold on to him tightly, as if she was holding on to the last piece of driftwood. From 6 to 10 o'clock, he kept pestering her, sweat stained the whole sheet, and when he finally let go of her, they were like two fish. Snow slowly closed her eyes, still lost in the aftertaste of the song. He kissed her forehead and murmured, "That night, I didn't touch her. I never touched her." He said a lot. Sometimes she was awake, and sometimes she was blurry, but most of them were words of longing. Her body was a little stiff. When the sweat turned cold, she was shocked to realize that they had sex. Her fingers clenched the sheet, and her little mouth became a little pale. She trembled helplessly. "Yi Muyun, it's not right for us to do this." He was still kissing her little mouth, and he said in a low voice, "I said that I never touched her. Schwerer, I promise that everything I've said is the truth." He bit her little mouth. "Although I was very angry, I didn't sleep that night and let her stay in the guest room." Cher opened her eyes. "What's with the hickey on her neck?" "Hickey?" Yi Muyun frowned. "I don't know. Maybe we can ask Song Karen in person." Cher didn't have the face to ask. After a while, she bit her lip and said, "Let's just treat what happened today as an accident." She wanted to get up, but he hugged her waist. Perhaps it was because Yu had finally been released. His temper was especially good. He kissed her neck and said, "Be good, I'll carry you to the bathroom." Cher didn't move. After a while, she said in a low voice, "I'll still go back to America." Yi Muyun frowned. "You responded just now, and you even enjoyed it." Her reaction couldn't lie. She liked that he loved her. When they were doing it just now, she whispered that she missed him. Cher curled up at the head of the bed and wrapped herself in the bedsheet. Her voice was soft. "No." She looked at him and said seriously, "I'm used to being alone. I'm used to living in America." "I can go with you to America," he said without thinking. Schwerer looked up at him. He had a serious expression on his face. "Let me think about it," she said in a low voice and ran into the bathroom as though she was escaping. Yi Muyun didn't chase after her immediately. He just casually lit a cigarette. Actually, his body wasn't satisfied yet. He still wanted her. Chapter 2174. Guzé had been standing guard outside the door for hours. From the moment they entered, Guzé couldn't return home. At this moment, he heard Yi Muyun's words and paused for a moment. "Mr. Yi, a camera caught you and Cher going back to the room together just now." Yi Muyun narrowed his eyes and said calmly, "Find a room outside tonight." Guzé was stunned. How could there be such a thing? But thinking about it, Mr. Yi had probably been holding it in for a long time. Just as Yi Muyun finished speaking, Cher came out of the bathroom, already dressed. "I have to go." She wanted to leave, but how could he let her go so easily? He reached out to stop her and said hoarsely, "The camera is outside." Do you want to go out now and be caught? Cher glared at him. Sleep first. I'll sleep on the sofa. His tone was calm, but as domineering as before. I'll call you tomorrow morning. Since they had already done it, she wouldn't be bashful anymore. But she still asked, where's Guzet? Why? Do you still want to be in a room with two men? He asked coldly in an unfriendly tone. Cher picked up a pillow beside her and threw it at his face. Yi Muyun, you're shameless. He took the pillow away expressionlessly and walked towards the sofa with it in his hand. He turned off the lights. The sudden darkness made Cher a little uncomfortable. She stood in the dark for a long time before she finally moved her body and lay on the bed carefully. But she was still a little afraid, so she didn't dare to fall asleep. In the darkness, she heard his voice. I won't touch you again. He probably felt that his words weren't convincing enough, so he added, I'm exhausted. Even in the darkness, even if he couldn't see, Cher's face was still red and burning. She buried her face in the pillow. There seemed to be a faint male scent on it. It was his scent. That kind of pure masculine breath made her blush and her heart beat faster. As she buried her face, she felt that her face was getting hotter. How could she fall asleep? After all, they were in the same space, and they used to be so intimate. Not to mention, they just had sex. Cher buried her face and closed her eyes. All she could see was the scene of them hugging each other. She bit her lip and buried her face even deeper. She even felt a little embarrassed. She was no longer a little girl. Just because they had sex once, she was shaken. Tang Cher, have you forgotten that you still have to go back to America? The night deepened. In the dark bedroom, her breathing finally calmed down. But Yi Muyun couldn't sleep the whole night. On the other side, Guzet hung up the phone and looked at the moon. Then, he saw a beautiful figure by the sea. It was Qin Mu. Why was she sitting on the beach at this hour? Moreover, the sea breeze was strong, and she was still wearing a thin layer of clothing. Guzet pursed his lips and walked over slowly. He sat down beside her and copied her action of throwing a pebble into the sea. The sea was so deep that the bottom couldn't be seen. Guzet, you also think that a pebble can't change anything, right? Qin Mu's voice was very low. Do you think I'm stupid? For her brother and Cher, she didn't hesitate to be alone with Zhou Chongguang. But she didn't want to be with Zhou Chongguang on a night like this. She would rather come out to see the sea, even though it was cold. Chapter 2175. Guzet's gaze had been on the sea, but he looked away and smiled faintly. No, you're fine. He took off his shirt and put it on her shoulders. Qin Mu looked at it and wanted to take it off, but Guzet stopped her. After you catch a cold, I think Zhou Chongguang will take care of you. Qin Mu glared at him. He really knew how to pick on her sore spot. In the end, she still put on his shirt, looked at the sea quietly, and threw pebbles silently. Guzet was only wearing a singlet as he sat next to her. He would look at her side profile from time to time. Her expression was focused, and she would throw a pebble from time to time. Guzet thought that Qin Mu was actually still a little girl. She had endured things that she shouldn't have, and it was still the same even now. I apologize on behalf of Gu Mei. Guzet looked at her sideways and said mildly. Qin Mu smiled. There's nothing to apologize for. Zhou Chongguang was never my lover. There's no point in me staying with a man who doesn't love me. She paused for a moment and continued, even without Gu Mei, there's still Lin Shui and Zhao Shui. He'll never lack women by his side. Guzet looked down. But the harm that Gu Mei did to you is real? Harm? Qin Mu sighed softly. Probably in the past, but now I really don't care. She looked at the endless dark blue sea and smiled faintly. Guzet, I just want to end all of this as soon as possible and start a new life abroad. She stretched and turned her head to look at him. Her eyes were clear and bright, like stars in the night sky. Guzet looked at her and couldn't help but feel a little lost. After a long time, he said in a low voice, Can I go abroad to see you? Qin Mu broke into a smile. Her smile bloomed in the dark night, as beautiful as a spider lily. She said, Guzet, you can't. We are not friends. Guzet looked at the sea again. His expression was a little deep. After a long time, he said in a low voice, I don't want to be friends with you. However, he knew that it was impossible for them to progress to the final step. Even if she didn't hate Gu Mei, she wouldn't be able to accept him. Furthermore, she and Zhou Chongguang weren't clear. Qin Mu didn't say anything more. There was no need for them to have a deep conversation. Sitting together like this was already their limit. Perhaps they were too lonely, so they sat there until 2 o'clock at night. It was too cold, so he suggested, Let me take you back to your room. Qin Mu shook her head. I don't want to go back. Guzet didn't want her to be alone with Zhou Chongguang, but he didn't want her to catch a cold. So he got up and pulled her up. I'm looking for a room for you. With that said, he smiled. I'm the same as you, homeless. Qin Mu's eyes widened. As you think, Cher and Mr. Yi are together, Guzhe said vaguely. Qin Mu's eyes widened like a little girl's. Guzhe smiled faintly. I'm going to get a room too. He gave her a light push on her back. Qin Mu was still in a daze, so Guzhe brought her to the hotel. Guzhe asked for 2 suites from the receptionist. The receptionist said awkwardly, I'm sorry, Mr. Gu. We only have 1 room left tonight. Chapter 2176. Guzhe immediately held her slender arm. Qin Mu. His voice was a little anxious. Qin Mu tilted her head to look at him and said slowly, Mr. Gu, even if I'm going to divorce Zhou Chongguang, I can't possibly stay in the same room with a man who's practically a stranger. She was no longer a 14-year-old girl who could easily fall in love. She thought that based on Guzhe's looks and temperament, if it wasn't for Zhou Chongguang, the 22-year-old Qin Mu might have fallen for him. However, there were no ifs in life. It was impossible. It was impossible. Guzhe's eyes were as dark as the night. He looked at her quietly for a while before saying, You stay alone. His voice was especially calm and decisive. Qin Mu's heart was slightly disturbed, but she still shook her head. Guzhe, you stay here. I can go back to my room. She knew that he was worried that she would catch a cold, so in order to appease him, she was willing to stay in the same room with Zhou Chongguang. Guzhe's fingers tightened slightly, and his gaze became a little unpredictable. Qin Mu knew that he liked her, but it was only now that she realized how passionate his feelings were. She didn't want to be tainted by him, and she didn't want to owe anyone anything. So after staring at him for a long time, she suddenly pushed him away and ran to her room. Guzhe clenched his fingers tightly, looking at her disappearing figure in the dark night. How could he not know what she was thinking? Qin Mu just wanted to avoid him. So silly. He took his room card and walked in her direction. He saw Zhou Chongguang open the door, and saw Zhou Chongguang pull her in. Guzhe stood at the door of their bedroom, almost masochistically. He looked at the door and thought about all the things that had happened behind it. He liked a girl, and before he realized it, he had liked her for a long time. By the time he realized it, it was too late to stop, and he didn't want to. Because looking at her from afar, she had become his little happiness. How could he bear to stop? God knew how happy he was when he heard that she and Zhou Chongguang were going to divorce. Because, he and she, had an extra 1 in a million chance. Inside the room, Zhou Chongguang was wearing a white bathrobe, pulling Qin Mu into his arms. Qin Mu struggled. Zhou Chongguang, are you crazy? He didn't make a sound. He just pressed her between the door and his body and stared at her with a judgmental gaze. Qin Mu's back slammed into the door, and it hurt a little. You spent the whole night reflecting and came back at 1 in the morning wearing men's clothes, huh? Zhou Chongguang's expression was very unpleasant. He pressed her down with one hand and peeled off the men's shirts with the other. Qin Mu's body trembled. Only then did she remember that she came back wearing Guzhe's clothes. Looking up, she pursed her lips and looked at Zhou Chongguang's handsome but twisted face. Someone lent it to me because I'm cold. Did he have any other thoughts about you, huh? Zhou Chongguang leaned forward, and his large palm had already started to check his territory to see if it had been occupied by other men. Qin Mu almost screamed. She looked at Zhou Chongguang in disbelief, and then she started to struggle violently. Zhou Chongguang, you bastard, let go of me. Zhou Chongguang checked thoroughly and firmly. His handsome face didn't have a trace of softness as he tormented her roughly. I have to ensure that my wife's body and mind belong to me. Chapter 2177. Zhou Chongguang's gaze deepened. He stared at her little face and sneered, is that so? Legally speaking, you're still my wife. He paused for a moment before he said mercilessly, which means that whatever I want to do to you is legal. Qin Mu's expression changed instantly. She looked at him and almost screamed, Zhou Chongguang, you can't. His voice was firm. You know I can. He pressed down on her, leaned over and whispered into her ear, Qin Mu, do you think Guzhe is outside right now? His fingers pinched her little face shamelessly. If I want you now, will he give up? Qin Mu's body trembled slightly. She looked up at him and said, Zhou Chongguang, you bastard. He pinched her little face and said in a deep voice, wouldn't I be letting you down if I don't do some bastard things? Huh? He lowered his head and kissed her little mouth, swallowing all her resistance. Qin Mu struggled, but he held her wrist firmly and pinned her body to the door. He sealed her little mouth and forcefully took her. Qin Mu's tears fell. She looked at him accusingly with her watery eyes, but she couldn't stop him. Zhou Chongguang was extremely tough. He rarely treated her in such a domineering manner, especially in bed. But now, he was pressing down on her without a care in the world, crushing her broken voice. Outside the door, Guze was standing and naturally heard the sounds behind the door. Zhou Chongguang probably knew about it and was doing it on purpose for him to see. His fingers slowly clenched. At that moment, he almost wanted to rush in and stop Zhou Chongguang. But what was he, Guze? He didn't have any standpoint. He was even Zhou Chongguang's brother who was having an affair. If he rushed in, how ironic would that be? Guze stood there for a very, very long time. He did not know if it was half an hour or an hour. He only knew that the sex in the room had not stopped. Zhou Chongguang was very good at this. As a man, Guze could feel it through the door. Did Qin Mu endure it for 4 years? When Guze left, his heart was as wet as water. Instead of returning to his room, he went to the seaside where he and Qin Mu had sat before. He sat there alone, looking at the sea, throwing stones, imagining a little girl sitting next to him. In the suite, after a long time, Zhou Chongguang finally let go of Qin Mu. As soon as he let go of her, her body slowly slid down, so Zhou Chongguang hugged her again and said in a low voice, "Are you sad?" Qin Mu did not want to talk to him. She turned her face to the side, and there were traces of tears on her little face. Zhou Chongguang's heart didn't feel very good. Did she really not like him? However, seeing her helpless look, his heart softened a little. No matter what, he was the one who bullied her. He reached out and carried her back to the bed. He knelt beside her and lifted her long hair, revealing her little face. Naturally, Qin Mu was still angry. She ignored him and turned her little face to the side. However, it was probably because it was really painful. Her tears rolled down again, and they did not stop. "Why are you crying again? Does it hurt?" he asked in a very low voice with a little more tenderness in his heart. Chapter 2178. Qin Mu bit her lip and kicked his shoulder. "Zhou Chongguang, get lost." However, he grabbed her little foot and his gaze was very hot. "If you didn't deliberately anger me, would I treat you like this?" Qin Mu opened her teary eyes and glared at him. "Stop making excuses." Compared to her body, she felt more wronged. How could Zhou Chongguang be like this? If he wanted her, he wanted her. He didn't allow her to resist at all. What about their agreement? Qin Mu's lips trembled slightly. "I want to leave the show." Her words were a little childish. Zhou Chongguang laughed and rubbed her little foot. "Mumu, be good. I'm not that familiar with you." Qin Mu kicked him again. Unexpectedly, he didn't stop her and allowed her to kick him. He looked like he was very indulgent of her. However, although he indulged her, he still controlled her and didn't let her move. He said in a low and hoarse voice, "You clearly felt it just now." Although they hadn't been getting along very well in the past 4 years, he was still her husband and they had done a lot of things between husband and wife. Her body's reaction couldn't lie to him. Just now, apart from the pain, she had also enjoyed it. As her husband, he could naturally feel it. Qin Mu's little face was burning and her whole face was bright. She bit her lip and didn't say a word for a long time. Zhou Chongguang leaned over and kissed her little mouth. He said in a low voice, "Mumu, let's make up. There won't be anyone else in the future, okay?" When he said those words, he was sincere. When he was hugging her just now, he really felt that he could spend the rest of his life with her alone. At least, he liked her and was willing to make a commitment to her. Qin Mu pursed her lips and didn't say a word. He knew that she was unwilling. It didn't matter. If she didn't agree, he could wait. If she didn't agree, he could also wait for a year. But he wouldn't lose any of his rights as a husband. Zhou Chongguang smiled faintly and rolled to the side. "I'll get a towel to wipe you." Just as he was about to leave, Qin Mu's little hand grabbed onto his arm. Zhou Chongguang turned around in surprise. "Qin Mu? There's nothing between me and Guze." Qin Mu closed her eyes. "Don't take revenge on him." Zhou Chongguang chuckled. "You sound like you're speaking up for him. So, why should I believe you?" Qin Mu suddenly opened her eyes, and her gaze was a little cold. "Zhou Chongguang, if you don't mind, I will make you a cuckold. In the future, after we get divorced, you will be with Gu Mei, and I will be with Guze. We will still be a family, and this is also fate." At first, Zhou Chongguang was angry, but after a while, he laughed in a low voice. He went to get a towel to wipe her body, and his technique was quite outrageous. Qin Mu closed her eyes and didn't want to pay attention to him. When he was done, his breath was also messy. He threw the towel aside and chuckled. "Mumu, I promise this will never happen again." Qin Mu didn't say anything. In fact, she was just saying it. But she and Zhou Chongguang didn't expect that sometimes what they said would come true. Zhou Chongguang also used up a lot of energy, and he was a little tired. He glanced at Qin Mu and said, "Let's sleep." Qin Mu didn't object to him sleeping next to her. They had done it just now, and it was a little pretentious to let him sleep on the sofa now. Chapter 2179. In the dead of the night, Zhou Chongguang was about to fall asleep. But over the years, he had developed the habit of being vigilant. As long as there was a slight movement, he would wake up. So when Qin Mu got up at night, Zhou Chongguang woke up almost immediately. He opened his eyes and didn't make a sound. He just watched the slender figure in the dark walk to the sofa. He remembered that her bag was there. Under the faint moonlight, he saw Qin Mu open the zipper and take out a white medicine bottle from his bag. He opened it and took out a pill, swallowing it in one gulp. Zhou Chongguang's heart skipped a beat. He knew what she was taking. It was the contraceptive pill. He knew that she didn't want their child, but he still felt bad that she was taking it secretly. She knew that he wanted a child, but she still took the pill secretly. So when they had sex just now, did she think that she was bitten by a dog? Zhou Chongguang's face was very ugly. He restrained himself from getting up and throwing the pill away. Because if he did, they would probably be finished. After taking the pill, Qin Mu quietly climbed onto the bed and lay down beside him. He knew that her eyes were open, and he knew that she wasn't asleep. He even knew that she hated and despised him now. His essence, she would also treat it as trash. He was originally very tired, but Zhou Chongguang couldn't sleep now. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw her carefully taking the pill. On the other hand, Qin Mu fell asleep after 5 minutes. It was a peaceful night, but the moment the sun rose, the entire social network crashed. Because the reality show Finding One's True Love had a few big news, it was simply explosive. Last night, there were 2 groups of people who were photographed, and they were both considered as having an affair, right? And they were all couples in real life. It was only the first night, and they couldn't wait anymore? The first photo couldn't be denied, and there was even a video. The CEO of Boyi, Yi Muyun, carried the ANN back to his and Gu Zhe's room. What happened after that, I'll omit 10,000 words. The second photo was even more explosive. After all, Yi Muyun was single, and it wasn't an exaggeration to say that he was with anyone, even though he and Song Karen were a couple. Qin Mu was different. As Chairman Ye's sister, she was married to Zhou Chongguang a long time ago and was a married woman. But late last night, Qin Mu had been with Gu Zhe the whole time. She was actually wearing Gu Zhe's shirt, sitting together by the sea, and hugging Gu Zhe. The tear in Qin Mu's eye was especially moving in the night. No one could deny that Zhou Chongguang had been cuckolded, and it was on a show he had invested in. The production team's official Weibo account exploded, and the entire Weibo was paralyzed. Zhou Chongguang pulled out the producer, wanting to fire him, but the producer was also very arrogant. He said calmly, "This show is called Finding One's True Love, and only those who can walk to the end of the show together will be counted. Zhou Zong, when you invested, you said that you wouldn't interfere with the progress of the show, and that what we took was the truth." Zhou Chongguang was so angry that he wanted to beat someone up. After a while, he put his hands on his waist and paced back and forth. "Delete the photo immediately. I can't do that. Now that the photo has been posted, if I delete it, it will undoubtedly prove that Zhou Zong is the grass on top of his head." The producer was not subtle at all. Zhou Chongguang's face turned green. Chapter 2180. Zhou Chongguang looked at the producer quietly. After a long time, he said softly, "Then go and do it now. Put up 2 pictures of me and your wife in love." The producer nodded. "Don't worry, Zhou Zong. This show will not be a mess. There can't be any scandals," Zhou Chongguang said coldly. The producer nodded and went to do it. Zhou Chongguang watched him leave. He lit a cigarette and took a puff. Last night, he forced himself on Qin Mu. After she woke up, she ignored him. He was a little angry, so he pressed her down and did it again. In the end, she cried and cursed him. However, the fiercer she cursed, the more excited he became. They had been married for so long. At this time, he finally got a taste of her. He couldn't bear to let her go. Later, when he went to see the producer, she ran away. After Zhou Chongguang finished smoking a cigarette, the production team happened to gather everyone. Everyone gathered in the hall. When Zhou Chongguang arrived, he saw Qin Mu. She was close to Tang Sher. When she saw him, there was a hint of wariness in her eyes. Zhou Chongguang chuckled. Did she think she would be safe if she stayed close to Tang Sher? How stupid. Later, when they were on their own, she still had to be with him. But what Zhou Chongguang didn't expect was that this time, the production team would let the members form teams voluntarily. Qin Mu immediately stuck to Shui-er. Shui-er looked at her and felt a little helpless. She could roughly guess what happened between Qin Mu and Zhou Chongguang last night. Qin Mu's neck had a big hickey, while Zhou Chongguang's face was full of lust. Cher didn't say anything. It was probably because she had sex with Yi Muyun last night. Gu Zhe looked at Yi Muyun and smiled. Then, Zhao Yan said with a smile, "Zhou Zong, let's reluctantly cooperate. Zhou Chongguang looked at his wife with a burning gaze. The producer coughed lightly and said, "Today is the first test. It's very simple. Each team will make their own lunch, and a professional panel of judges will come and taste it to see which team does the best." Cher and Qin Mu looked at each other and silently returned to their original positions. Because none of them knew how to cook. Zhou Chongguang gave the producer a look of appreciation. "Well done." The producer raised his hand. "We've arranged for 6 kitchens in front. Guests, please go over and show your skills." Zhou Chongguang looked at Qin Mu. "Do you know how to do it?" Qin Mu snorted. Zhou Chongguang smiled and held her hand, leading the way. As he walked, he said shamelessly, "Don't you know whether I know how to or not?" Qin Mu pursed her lips and didn't say anything. After that, the other teams went over, including Yi Muyun and Gu Zhe. Only Tang Cher and Zhao Yan were left. Zhao Yan crossed his arms in front of him and said confidently, "I don't know how to cook." Cher imitated him and snorted coldly. "I don't know how to cook either." One was a young master who only knew how to play the zither, while the other was a young mistress who only knew how to draw. Neither of them gave in to the other. In the face of smoke and smoke, the boat of friendship had capsized. Cher snorted. "I'm here to accompany you. Moreover, you're my little uncle. It's only right that you cook for me." Zhao Yan chuckled. "Sai, you're a woman and I'm a man. It's only right for a woman to cook." Chapter 2181. Zhao Yan pinched her little nose and harumphed. "I'm your little uncle, so I don't need to serve you." He glanced over and saw the man standing not too far away. Then, he smiled. He looked at his niece meaningfully. "Cher, how about this? Gu Zhe and Yi Muyun both know how to cook. Why don't you seduce Yi Muyun and I seduce Gu Zhe? Let's see if we can get someone to cook for us?" Cher glared at him. "Zhao Yan, I'll record this and let your fans hear it." Zhao Yan laughed. "So, that's why you went to seduce Gu Zhe?" Shui'er covered her mouth and giggled happily. Zhao Yan looked at her and couldn't help but laugh. Then, his gaze became unfathomable. "You didn't go back to your room to sleep last night. Where did you sleep?" Cher immediately exploded. She had clearly sneaked back at dawn. How did he know? Zhao Yan said in a low voice, "So, you seduce Yi Muyun, hm?" Cher glared at him. What kind of inhumane program was this? What kind of inhumane little uncle was this? What kind of little uncle would ask his niece to seduce a man like this? She harumphed and her gaze met Yi Muyun's. His gaze was a little deep. She quickly turned her face away. She felt a burning sensation in her heart. How was she going to seduce him? They even rolled around together at night. Cher pursed her lips and lowered her head. She said in a low voice, "Go ahead." Zhao Yan didn't reply for a long time. She looked up, and was stunned. He had already left. Shui'er was furious, but Zhao Yan waved his hand at her from afar. She heard an elegant voice. "It's been so many years and you still don't know how to cook?" Cher twisted her slender fingers and harumphed in acknowledgement. "Idiot." His voice had a strange tinge of emotion. Then, he stroked her little head. "Let's go." "Go?" She looked up at him, her eyes filled with shock. Yi Muyun smiled, her gaze indifferent. "Go cook." He paused again and chuckled. "Do you want to make love more?" Cher pursed her lips and looked at him absent-mindedly. After a long time, she slowly said, "Where's Karen?" He had already walked to her side, lowered his head slightly, and pressed his thin lips against her ear, saying in a low voice, "Last night when you hugged me and said continue, why didn't you think of her?" Cher was furious. She stretched out her hand to slap him, but he caught it easily. She glared at him. Yi Muyun chuckled. "I've said it before. I've broken up with her and I haven't touched her." He paused. "I'll only say this once. I won't explain it again." She was a little absent-minded and did not come back to her senses for a long time. He took the opportunity to grab her little hand and walked towards the kitchen that she and Zhao Yan had been assigned to. Cher snapped back to reality and said, Isn't it a little inappropriate for us to do this?" "Song Karen?" Yi Muyun asked calmly. Cher could not answer him. Yi Muyun smiled. "Since when have you become so kind?" There was a sense of mockery in his tone. She did not know why, but Cher thought of last night. They had rolled around last night. Honestly speaking, it was a form of mockery for her to mention Song Karen now. So, she did not say a word. He could do whatever he wanted. It would be best if Song Karen hated him out of love and gave him 2 slaps. Although that was what she was thinking, her heart could not help but race. Why had he not touched Song Karen all this while? Actually, she knew the answer in her heart, but she did not dare to think about it. Chapter 2182. Because just thinking about it was sinful. Yi Muyun held her hand and walked towards the kitchen. Just as they were about to reach the kitchen, Song Karen suddenly stood in front of them, blocking their way and looking at them quietly. Song Karen's eyes were watery and her voice trembled slightly. Muyun, is this the reason why you suddenly broke up with me? Yi Muyun stood still. Cher's fingers quietly struggled, but he gripped her hand even tighter. She couldn't break free and could only let him hold her hand. Yi Muyun looked at Song Karen calmly. Yes. Cher was stunned. Could he not be so honest? Although she didn't want to, she didn't explain. After all, she was in no position to explain. Explaining would only make her look hypocritical. Moreover, she had indeed done it with Yi Muyun many times last night. When Song Karen heard what Yi Muyun said, her face turned even paler and her lips trembled. Muyun and Ann are my business partners. I thought you knew about our past. Otherwise, why would you say that we spent the night together? Yi Muyun said mercilessly. Song Karen was a little embarrassed. After a long time, she said in a low voice, "That's because I love you." She looked up. I don't believe that I'm not as good as her. At this moment, Cher struggled to break free from Yi Muyun's hand. She took a deep breath and said to Song Karen, "Miss Song, we've already broken off our business relationship. In fact, I never signed a contract with you. As for Yi Muyun, I'm more inclined to let things go awry. I don't need him to take responsibility, so I don't want to get involved in your affairs. It has nothing to do with me." With that, she turned around and left. She was no longer the little girl from 8 years ago. She had wronged herself once because of him, but there wouldn't be a second time. She walked away with her back straight. She hadn't wronged anyone. She hadn't initiated it last night, so there was no need for her to feel guilty. Yi Muyun didn't stop her. He only looked at her back for a while before turning to look at Song Karen. Song Karen's body was still trembling, as if he couldn't take such a blow. "I think I've been very obvious in the past 2 to 3 years, he said softly as an explanation. "I tried hard to fall in love with you, but I didn't." Song Karen leaned forward and said in a sharp voice, "But you being with her like this is the greatest harm to me." She burst into tears and her lips couldn't stop trembling. "Just when I thought you finally fell in love with me." She raised her delicate face, trying to stop her tears, but she couldn't. After a long time, she said sternly, "I told Ann so excitedly that I was about to get engaged. My boyfriend was so outstanding and he loved me very much." As Song Karen spoke, his voice became very soft. "At the time, do you think she was laughing at me? Because she knows better than anyone who you've always loved in your heart." Yi Muyun remained silent. Song Karen's voice became more and more mocking. "When I told her that you broke up with me, she was so happy, wasn't she? Even though she knew that I loved you, she still got together with you." Song Karen sneered, "Is the person you love such a hypocritical woman? Are you done?" Yi Muyun finally lost his temper. His voice was very cold. "If you're done, then get lost." Chapter 2183. His slender fingers played with the lighter as he said softly, "One word from me and you will disappear from the show immediately." Song Karen's face was aghast. "I don't believe you." "Yes, this show is not a project that I invested in, but it is Zhou Chongguang who invested in it, isn't it? You should be able to tell that he wants to get Qin Mu back now. Do you think my words will work?" Yi Muyun said coldly. Then, he took out his phone and made a call. Song Karen wanted to slap his phone like crazy, but Yi Muyun moved aside and looked at her coldly. "Song Karen, you wouldn't joke around with your art gallery and your family, would you?" His voice was very cold. "If you want to keep everything you have now, then leave immediately." Song Karen's voice was extremely shrill. "You bastard." But he was indeed a threat to her, and she had to consider her own situation. Encountering him was undoubtedly not a rational choice. Song Karen still left. She left that day with her luggage, and the production team immediately replaced her with a female star to increase the popularity of the show. As for Song Karen, she would also be removed from the show and would not appear in a single scene. What was there to see about an abandoned woman? Why not just film Mr. Ye's heroic posture when he was cooking? After sending Song Karen away, Yi Muyun walked into the small kitchen that belonged to Cher. The kitchen here was separated by rooms, and each room was about 10 square meters. It wasn't big, and when the two of them stood inside, they were practically sticking to each other's backs, but it gave them a sense of intimacy. Yi Muyun walked in with a cigarette between his fingers and saw that Cher was squatting down and peeling potatoes. She didn't do it, so she was naturally clumsy. He did not help her immediately, but chuckled softly at the side. "Idiot." She ignored him and was obviously sulking, which made him want to laugh. Yi Muyun stared at her, watching as she worked hard, but she only managed to do one part of the work with all her strength. He held a cigarette in one hand and smoked it slowly. He said slowly, "Are you angry?" He paused for a moment, then laughed in a low voice. "The one who should be angry is Song Karen. You slept with her boyfriend. You're the one who forced me." Cher looked up at him angrily. "And," she poked his heart with her little finger, "do you think I will still like a man without principles like you?" He was stunned for a moment before he laughed out loud. "You've grown up? You dare to talk back?" Cher pursed her lips into a straight line, and her face darkened. After a long while, she sneered, "Yi Muyun, every word you say implies the past." She paused for a moment before continuing, "Do you think we can still be the same after 8 years? I'm not that innocent little girl anymore." She stood up and looked down at him from above. She slowly said, "We ended a long time ago. Let's just pretend that last night was a sunny day." But the moment she stood up, Yi Muyun pulled her down again. This time, he quickly threw the cigarette butt away and hugged her. Both of them were uncomfortable squatting and hugging, but he couldn't care less. He didn't like the tone she used to speak to him, as if she had really flown away. And in his heart, she had never left. Chapter 2184. He was the first to admit defeat. Even though he hated her, blamed her, and wanted to beat Sundra, his little girl was really amazing. She was really different from before. If he were to be like that again, she would really not want him anymore. So, he begged in a low voice, "I broke up with her. Come back to me, okay?" Cher looked down. "Yi Muyun, I can't give you anything. Don't start again when it's over. Otherwise, it will only hurt." He hugged her tightly and his voice was a little bewitching. "No, not this time." He hugged her very tightly and used all his strength. She felt as though she was crushed into his bones and blood. It was actually very painful, but she didn't push him away. She was hugged by him quietly and wanted to tell herself that this was the last time. However, he didn't allow her to have such a thought. He lowered his head and kissed her lips. He kissed her forcefully in the narrow space and couldn't stop. He was kissing her so hard that he stumbled. His body was against the cupboard behind him, and she was sitting in his arms. She still couldn't resist his seduction. Her little hands hugged his neck and brought herself to him. This kiss slowly became painful. It was a mixture of all their longing, unwillingness, and anger. When he let go of her, she was shocked to realize that she was crying. The warm tears flowed down his neck and stained his cheeks. Yi Muyun reached out and caressed her little face gently. He said in a low voice, "Why are you crying?" He couldn't bear to treat her like that anymore. He kissed away the tears on her little face. Cher's tears couldn't stop falling. She looked at him with nostalgia and a tinge of pain. Suddenly, she moved closer to his red lips and kissed him on her own accord. He hadn't hugged her for a long time. How could he resist? The kiss was very long, and it almost went off the rails in such an open kitchen. Finally, they were woken up by a sound at the door. It was Zhao Yan at the door. He seemed to look at the two of them in surprise and chuckled. Then Boss Yi, please continue to cook. Zhao Yan left in a good mood. He probably didn't need to work these days. Just hand it over to Yi Muyun. Cher was still sitting in Yi Muyun's embrace, while he was sitting on the ground. It was truly an unbearable sight. She ran her fingers through her hair and stood up. "Zhao Yan." He didn't stop and waved his hand again. "I'm not interested in being an audience. Also, be careful. The cameras will come and take pictures at any time. If you don't want to be famous, you'd better restrain yourself." As if he had thought of something, Zhao Yan suddenly turned around and grinned. "If you really can't take it anymore, you can go back to your room. At most, you can just say it's to practice your lines. That's a pretty good reason. That's what everyone says when something happens in the entertainment industry these days." Cher casually tossed a potato at Zhao Yan, who dodged it with ease, a smile on his face. Cher stared at his back and suddenly had a feeling. She was not the one accompanying Zhao Yan, but Zhao Yan was the one accompanying her. She called out to Zhao Yan. "Little uncle." She rarely called him that. Every time she called him that, it meant it was something serious. Zhao Yan turned his head to look at her and smiled. "It's exactly what you're thinking. Cher, you should learn psychology. Also, please don't try to matchmake me." She opened her mouth and didn't say a word for a long time. She could only watch him leave. "Still angry?" She heard Yi Muyun's voice. Cher took a deep breath and turned around. "Yi Muyun, we can only be friends." Chapter 2185. Cher glared at him. He was too shameless. Yi Muyun pursed his lips and reached out to pinch her little face. "Call me brother and repeat what you said just now. HM?" Cher was still glaring at him, but her mind was filled with the memories of those nights when she was pressed down by him, helplessly and weakly calling him brother. Her little face blushed slightly. Yimuyun stared at her little face and chuckled. He reached out to stroke her soft cheeks and asked in a low voice, "Are you thinking about the past?" "No." She answered too quickly, making it seem like she was trying to hide something. Yimuyun chuckled in a low voice. "No? Let me check." As she screamed, he covered her little chest and felt her rapidly beating heart. Cher's back was against the counter. She pursed her lips and glared at him. "Yimuyun, don't do anything rash." He chuckled in a deep voice. "Then I'll do it properly? HM?" He wanted to do something to her again, but Cher slipped past him. Her little face was a little tense as she looked at him. Her heart was heaving up and down violently. "Yimuyun, what are women to you? No matter how bad Song Karen is, she was still your girlfriend, wasn't she?" Her gaze was a little cold. And he had been listening to her words and looking at her face. After a long time, he smiled. The little girl has grown up and changed. Cher was still leaning on the same spot and staring at him. Yimuyun smiled again. "Cher, being kind to her is being cruel to you. I won't change that." Cher stared into his eyes and didn't say a word. Later, Yimuyun picked her up and carried her to the counter at the side. She wanted to break free, but he wouldn't let her. He reached out to support her body and said in a low voice, "Sit here and don't move." She tried to move again, but he chuckled. "I'll kiss you if you move again." Cher's body trembled, but she didn't say anything else. Yimuyun slowly let go of her and smiled. Then, he picked up the potato that she had just peeled and peeled it with familiarity. He cut it into thin shreds and added some red chili. Cher was a little surprised. Since when did he know how to do this? "After you left, I moved out. Sometimes I don't want to eat out, so I make some simple food." As if he sensed her thoughts, his voice was very calm. Cher pursed her lips and didn't say anything. After that, she was even more surprised to find that he was not a simple person. He made fish balls. The fish meat was picked up by him, then rolled into a ball. Then, he put it in the boiling water for a while, and it turned into small white balls. After looking at it for a long time, she couldn't help but ask, "What kind of dish is this?" Yimuyun smiled. "Just use baby cabbage, add black fungus, and a spoonful of fish balls." She let out an "oh" sound. Then, she watched as he cut a few more vegetables. This time, without waiting for her to speak, he explained mildly, "Make a 4-happiness soup." Cher's eyes widened as she looked at him. "Is it strange?" Yimuyun smiled a little warmly, completely different from the one she had seen before. After he finished processing the ingredients and before he put them into the wok to fry, his voice was very calm. "I learned it a long time ago." He paused for a moment, and his voice sounded a little distant. "I've been waiting for someone to eat my food, but I haven't seen anyone after waiting for a long time." Chapter 2186. Yimuyun looked at her and chuckled. "Shuebao, you sound a little sour." He didn't explain further because his relationship with Song Karen was over. Cher was right. In this relationship, he was a little immoral and unfair to Song Karen. But love was selfish. He didn't think he was wrong. If he didn't break up now, he would regret it in the future. Cher didn't deny what he said, but she didn't say anything either. He just sat there in a daze, gently shaking his legs. It wasn't until the smell of the wok wafted up that she saw that the shredded potatoes looked good and smelled good. She started to feel hungry as she smelled it. Cher pursed her lips and watched as he took the dishes to the side. He didn't want her to have a taste. She held it in. But when he took the second dish, she couldn't hold it in anymore. The fish balls, baby vegetables, and the wood ear were cooked really fragrant, and the color was really good too. Especially the golden leaves of the baby vegetables. She didn't know how he cooked them. In her memory, Sisterly didn't seem to have such good cooking skills. Cher couldn't hold it in anymore and snorted. "Aren't we supposed to work together?" Yimuyun was making the last soup. When he heard her, he said calmly, "What do you know how to cook?" His tone was a little mocking. Cher exploded. "I can taste it." His movements came to a complete halt. Then, he looked at her with a faint smile. "You know how to taste? Does that mean you know how to eat?" Cher blushed. "It's taste. Is there any difference from eating?" His voice was still calm. Cher snorted. "Don't you eat?" He tilted his head to look at her and suddenly smiled. Without saying anything, he held her waist and carried her to the small dining table by the side with one hand. He didn't care how much she ate or whether the production crew would come to film later. He only knew that his long-cherished wish had been fulfilled. She finally ate the dishes he made. Cher took a small bite. It tasted so good that her eyes turned into crescents, especially the fish balls. They tasted really good. She tried her best to eat, puffing up her cheeks and looking really cute. When Yimuyun finished making the last bowl of soup and brought it over, she saw her like this. After placing the soup on the table, he stood by the side and stared at her. At that moment, she looked like she did 8 years ago. It was as if he was looking at the little Cher of the past. Everything was as it had been in the past. His eyes were a little hot, and a faint smile appeared on his lips. He scooped a bowl of rice for her and placed it in front of her. He then sat beside her and asked softly, "Is it good?" Cher was quite satisfied with the food she liked. Besides, he wasn't that detestable now, so she nodded vigorously. "You don't know, I haven't had many decent Chinese meals when I was in America." After she finished speaking, she regretted it and looked at Yimuyun. His expression was somewhat unfathomable. After a long time, he said softly, "Has it been tough all these years?" She was used to being pampered. It was hard for him to imagine what kind of life she led abroad. Her English was so poor. If no one took care of her, she probably wouldn't even have enough to eat. It was no wonder she was so skinny now. Chapter 2187. Schwer looked up at him, her eyes watery. So did he. Time seemed to have stopped. The separation, the hurt, and Song Karen's past existence were all gone. All that was left was the little girl and her brother, the brother who loved her so dearly. The sunlight outside shone through the window and shone on them, forming a faint golden glow. Yimuyun turned his head and looked at her. After a long time, he smiled lightly and reached out to stroke her long hair. "Eat." She still didn't move. His voice became low and hoarse. "You're so skinny that you can make a sweet and sour pork ribs?" Cher pursed her lips. "I don't want to." Yimuyun looked at her little face and chuckled lightly. Stroking her again, he said, "Silly." He had thought of throwing her on the bed and making her into a dish of pork ribs himself. He smiled at the thought of her tender little face. Yimuyun felt that he was quite a pervert. As he thought of this, he suddenly looked into her eyes. Cher stared at him and spat out a few words. "You must be thinking about something perverted." He smiled and didn't say much, only stroking her long hair. Cher pursed her lips. She knew it. She buried her face in her food and decided to ignore him. He didn't force her to talk and just watched her eat quietly. When she finished eating, there was only half of the food left. Yimuyun looked at her in surprise. It was really hard to imagine that her stomach could hold so much food. A small bowl of rice and almost half of the dishes. Cher also felt that her stomach was round and bloated. Looking at his gaze, she felt a little embarrassed. How could she let her guard down against the enemy? She definitely wouldn't eat his food next time. "Why aren't you eating?" Cher bit her finger and leaned back. Her stomach was really a little bloated. Yimuyun looked at her quietly and then laughed. "Concerned about me? Eat if you want." She snorted lightly and was about to stand up and go back to sleep. As for what the production team wanted to film, it had nothing to do with her. She even wanted to go back early. Deep in her heart, she knew that part of the reason why she didn't leave immediately was because of Yimuyun. She had just stood up when he grabbed her hand, preventing her from getting up. His slender fingers clasped hers, and then became 10 fingers interlocked. "Let me go," she said angrily. Yimuyun's voice was a little hoarse. "Help me scoop rice." Cher glared at him. He laughed. "What, you're not going to admit it after eating it?" There was a double meaning in his words. Her little face blushed. She couldn't break free from his grip and was extremely annoyed. In the end, she still gave in and said awkwardly, "Let go of me, I'll just fill it up." Only then did he let go of her. Looking at her blushing face, he smiled. "That's a good girl. I'm not a child anymore. You don't have to coax me like this. I won't fall for it." With that said, she stood up angrily and went to scoop a bowl of rice for him. Then, she sat opposite him and watched him eat. He didn't eat much and only tasted everything, but he still finished 2 bowls of rice. Cher pursed her lips. "Can I go back to my room now?" Yimuyun smiled. "It's our room?" She was stunned and glared at him. Chapter 2188. "Oh, I've already told the production team that you and Zhao Yan are related by blood, while Gu Zhe and I are both straight, so we're in the same group," he said very calmly, his face not red and his heart not beating fast. Cher was dumbfounded. How could there be such a thing? Weren't they supposed to be a couple? How could they change midway? After a long while, she snapped out of it and snorted. "Aren't Zhao Yan and Gu Zhe straight?" The man who had bullied her since she was young was even calmer now. "Just now, Zhao Yan expressed to me that he had feelings for Gu Zhe." Cher was about to vomit blood as she glared at him. "I don't believe it. Whether you believe it or not, your things have already been moved to my room." He smiled. Seeing her flustered and exasperated look actually made his mood better. Cher was about to explode. What kind of lousy show was this? This was practically a show where one person could be pimped out. Was it Zhou Chongguang who had invested in it? She stood up angrily. I'm going to look for Zhou Chongguang. Yi Muyun smiled nonchalantly. Of course you can, but Cher, if you go now, you might disturb him and Qin Mu. Zhou Chongguang and Qin Mu? Cher was stunned again. A moment later, she mumbled, you clearly know that Qin Mu no longer loves Zhou Chongguang and that she wants a divorce. Why do you still approve of Zhou Chongguang pestering Qin Mu? With that said, her expression cleared up. I believe that given your capabilities, it's not impossible for you to help Qin Mu go overseas. And you've been indulging Zhou Chongguang all this while. To think that two such men would actually work together for their own interests. Yes, it was a collaboration. Cher could already feel it. Yi Muyun didn't deny it. His voice was a little hoarse. How could you not know that I sacrificed Qin Mu for you this time? Everything she said was right. Cher's face darkened. She recalled how Qin Mu had told her resolutely that she wanted to leave Zhou Chongguang. But last night, they slept together again. Was all of this for her? She didn't want to be like this. She wasn't that little girl who couldn't survive without Yi Muyun. She didn't want to suffer that kind of heart-wrenching pain again. Cher pursed her lips and said word by word, Yi Muyun, I never need anyone's help. I don't need it. He looked at her and said nothing. Yes, I don't need it. Her voice was a little depressed. If Qin Mu sacrificed herself, what difference would it make from 8 years ago? Is there any difference between living like that and being dead? She clenched her fists and turned to walk out. His faint voice came from behind, then why don't you stay with me? Qin Mu had already walked out. If Cher returned to his side, Qin Mu wouldn't have to suffer anymore. Perhaps, Qin Mu knew this now, and that was why she did it. She had grasped Cher's weakness. She felt wronged, and this would speed up Cher's return to his side. However, Cher wasn't too bothered. She said that she didn't need it. He watched her walk out quietly. He could deeply feel that she had changed. She had changed. She could live well without him. The fear from 8 years ago struck him again. And this time, was he the only one who had to bear the storm? Had the wound on her heart healed long ago? Yi Muyun stood for 2 minutes and followed her out. Chapter 2189. Cher stood in front of Zhou Chongguang and Qin Mu's small kitchen and was stunned for a moment. Zhou Chongguang was cooking and Qin Mu was sitting at the small dining table, eating fruits. That fruit was supposed to be a platter, but Zhou Chongguang just let Qin Mu eat it? Cher looked at the expression on Qin Mu's face. It was so natural and cheerful, without any intention of forcing it. She was stunned. At this moment, Qin Mu looked up and saw Cher. She put down the fruit in her hand. But soon, she said happily, Cher, do you want to eat with us? Cher walked over slowly and sat down next to Qin Mu. Zhou Chongguang did not turn around. He only instructed Qin Mu calmly, you must think of a way to make up for the fruit you ate. HM? It sounded like he was reprimanding her, but there was a hint of intimacy in his tone. Cher looked at Qin Mu. Had they reconciled? She had thought that with Qin Mu's character, she would not pay much attention to Zhou Chongguang. But Qin Mu replied, think of a way yourself. This was a way that only married couples or lovers would do. It was a little coquettish. Snow's heart skipped a beat. Qin Mu stuffed a cherry tomato into Cher's mouth and smiled. Why are you in a daze? Cher was speechless for a moment and ate the cherry tomato quietly. Qin Mu glanced at Zhou Chongguang and lowered her head again. But she did not eat any more fruit. Cher pursed her lips and did not say a word. Under such circumstances, anything she said would be useless. Behind her, a shadow blocked the sunlight. She turned her head and saw Yi Muyun standing at the door. His expression was very calm. He walked over indifferently and sat beside her. His slender fingers reached out to touch her lips. You've just eaten your fill. Why are you eating again? Be careful not to get stuffed. Cher looked at him, then at Qin Mu and Zhou Chongguang. Everything was calm. Time seemed to have stopped. She thought that if Zhou Chongguang hadn't made such a request, and Qin Mu didn't have that kind of illness, it would have been better for them to be together like that. At least, it wouldn't be like this today. My head is a little dizzy. I want to go back and rest. She spoke in a low voice. Yi Muyun looked at her quietly, his expression gentle. After a long time, he nodded. I'll accompany you back. Cher didn't say anything and walked to the door. Suddenly, she turned around and looked at Qin Mu. I just want to ask you something. Qin Mu raised her head. Cher's voice was very slow. Do you still stand by what you said the other time? Qin Mu's expression was a little strange. After a long time, she said softly, some things will change. Cher didn't say anything more. She was a little dazed. If that was the case, what did her sacrifice back then count for? When she left, she was in a daze. Yi Muyun followed behind her. She turned around and looked at him. Her voice was very soft. I want to be alone for a while. His brows furrowed. But in the end, he acquiesced. She returned to her room. Now, she was sharing the room with Yi Muyun. She shut him outside and sat alone on the sofa by the window. She watched the tide rise and fall outside, her heart fluttering. The sunlight shone on her body. It was very warm. She thought of many things. When she was young, when she grew up, and the 8 years she spent in America. Yi Muyun stood outside the whole time. His mood was also very complicated. He stood there with a cigarette in his hand. When it was almost noon, Guze came over. Chapter 2190. Guze shook his head and looked serious. I've tried everything, but I can't find anything. Yi Muyun looked into the distance. After a while, he said in a low voice, That's not strange. Uncle Tang must have erased all the traces. Over the years, Tang Yu's attitude towards his relationship with Cher was different from before. Now, Uncle Tang probably didn't approve of it, so he couldn't find anything. This was the tacit understanding between men. There was no need to say it out loud. Guze didn't say anything else. The two men smoked together and looked at the skyline in the distance. And Cher was sitting just a wall away from him. He knew that she was there, but he couldn't see or touch her. Yi Muyun pursed his lips and frowned slowly. On the other side, Qin Mu was about to go back to her room when she saw Cher and the others leave. Where are you going? Zhou Chongguang's voice was a little hoarse. Qin Mu's voice was cold. The show is over. I'm going back to my room to rest. You want to throw me away after using me, huh? His voice was warm. She didn't know when he had leaned forward and put his thin lips behind her ear, which made Qin Mu's heart throb. Zhou Chongguang, what do you want to do? Qin Mu was a little annoyed. She turned around and glared at him. He pressed his hands on her shoulders and looked at her with a burning gaze. After a while, he said in a low voice, Qin Mu, regardless of whether what you said to Tang Shuer was true or not, I hope it's true. Her expression changed. He continued, Isn't it good for us to be like this? With that, he frowned. I can do it without anyone else. Qin Mu gently broke away from his hand and looked at him. She smiled. Zhou Chongguang, do you believe what you said? Zhou Chongguang pursed his lips. I want you to believe me. I don't believe it. Qin Mu's reaction was a little intense. I don't believe a word of it. I don't want to wait for you at home anymore. I don't want to be filled with anticipation or guess if you really like me anymore. Zhou Chongguang's heart skipped a beat and he looked at her deeply. Qin Mu probably felt that she was too emotional. She took a step back and softened her tone. Zhou Chongguang, I don't want to be like this anymore. Do you know how I felt when I heard what Gume said one day? She calmly said, that night, after we did it, you fell asleep beside me. At that time, I wanted to stab you to death with a knife. Zhou Chongguang's eyebrows twitched. You destroyed not only my dream, but also Cher and my brother's happiness. Qin Mu smiled and cried, If they are not happy, can I still love you? However, she immediately denied it and smiled sadly. No, Zhou Chongguang, I don't know how to love you anymore. Those women are not the most important, but our marriage has always been a lie. There is no love at all. He had never loved her at all, so she had no reason to forgive him. Zhou Chongguang listened carefully after she said so much. When he looked up again, he saw that her face was full of tears. Mumu, he said in a low voice, calling her name. Don't call me Zhou Chongguang like that. Qin Mu gently covered her face. Really, don't call me like that. Tell me, do you love me now? Or are you just pestering me because you don't want a divorce? Zhou Chongguang couldn't answer such a question at once. Chapter 2191. Zhou Chongguang couldn't answer such a question at once. At this moment, it was unwise to lie to her. Silence was the most rational choice for a man. After a long time, he said, But I care about you. Qin Mu smiled with tears in her eyes. I can find a dozen men who care about me. Even if they care about my money, they will still treat me like this. Qin Mu's voice was slow and deep. You enjoy your family while having countless women outside. Zhou Chongguang, what makes you think that you're still worthy of my love when you're so dirty? Zhou Chongguang looked at her, his eyes a little blurred. After a long time, he said in a low voice, At least give me a chance to pursue you. Qin Mu shook her head gently. No, Zhou Chongguang, I don't want to go down the clouds with you like this. He was stunned and looked at her. Qin Mu walked past him and wanted to leave, but he grabbed her arm again and said in a deep voice, Qin Mu. Qin Mu didn't say anything, but but she was immediately dragged into his arms and kissed hard. Zhou Chongguang. All her screams were swallowed by his mouth, and then she struggled helplessly. She clenched her fists and hit his shoulders desperately, but then he grabbed her and pressed her behind him. Such a posture was very shameful. It was as if she had been folded in his arms for him to enjoy. He kissed her so deeply that Qin Mu couldn't take it anymore. In the end, she had no choice but to bite him hard. That bite was firm. Zhou Chongguang was in pain and had to let go of her. Qin Mu took a step back and turned around to escape, but her body was tightly held by him from behind. His voice was warm. "Why are you running? Are you afraid that I'll eat you, huh?" His arms were so strong that he folded her in his arms, and his voice was also warm. "Mumu, I won't touch you. Don't go, okay?" His tone was full of pleading. Qin Mu couldn't move and was extremely angry. He said it was a request, but it was so overbearing. She couldn't break free, and she didn't want to pay attention to him either. So, she just stood there in a stalemate. But she didn't expect that the production crew would come over to film at this time. The scene of Zhou Chongguang hugging her was captured vividly. She didn't want to be on camera, so she turned her face to the side. Zhou Chongguang chuckled, pressed her little head on his shoulder, and said to the cameraman, "Okay, my wife is afraid of strangers. That's enough." Since the big boss had spoken, how could the people below not listen? Thus, they quickly retreated. As soon as he left, Qin Mu pushed Zhou Chongguang away and stomped on his foot. She snorted and said, "What a crooked show. The program wasn't wrong. It was my fault." He actually admitted it in a good temper. "Mumu, don't you feel that this show is tailor-made for us?" Qin Mu sneered. "Lin Shui is still in the show. Zhou Chongguang, aren't you embarrassed to say that?" Zhou Chongguang didn't take it seriously and chuckled. "If I'm thin-skinned, how can I coax my little wife back? She was young, really young. He was 6 years older than her. Actually, the age difference wasn't that big, but when they got married, she was only 18. Qin Mu glared at him and walked out. This time, Zhou Chongguang didn't stop her. He just looked at her quietly and watched her walk out. If she didn't want to turn back, he could wait and not force her. When Qin Mu walked to the door, she suddenly turned around and looked at Zhou Chongguang. Chapter 2192. Qin Mu ran away in defeat. Behind her, Zhou Chongguang's smile deepened. After a while, he called the producer over and whispered a few instructions to him. The producer was shocked and hesitated for a long time. "Zhou Zong, you invested hundreds of millions in this show. If we do as you say, it will all be for naught." He still had to invest in the later stages. Spending so much money was just for fun. The producer could not understand. Had the rich changed their way of chasing women? However, he still had to cooperate with his sugar daddy. So, he immediately went back and rewrote the script. Zhou Zong liked to be alone. So, he would let them be alone, and this round of the competition was practically useless. Zhou Zong did not even finish cooking and Mr. Yi had finished all of his food. There were other couples left, but they were just there to serve as foils. They were unimportant, all right? At noon, the production team announced that they would be taking a break in the afternoon. There would be a beach party at night. The female guests were required to wear gowns, while the male guests were free to wear whatever they wanted. Zhou Chongguang's ex-girlfriend, Lin Shui, looked at the table full of dishes and gritted her teeth. Is this show about them dating? She noticed that Zhao Yan and Guze were nowhere to be seen. Yi Muyun and Tang Sher shared a room, while Zhou Chongguang and Qin Mu stayed together. It was only now that she realized that she and Song Karen were just cannon fodder. No one had invited them here. Even if they had come, they would have been asked to leave sooner or later. Lin Shui's face alternated between white and red. She was very indignant, but she had no other choice. She was even more unwilling to leave. She could feel that if she left now, she would never have the chance to get close to Zhou Chongguang again. Yi Muyun sat on the sofa in the bedroom and watched as Cher packed her things. He frowned and asked, "What's wrong?" Cher zipped up her luggage and sneered, "My little uncle has left. Why should I stay here?" Was he going to stay here and be bullied by him? Yi Muyun smiled faintly, looked at her, and said slowly, "I don't remember you having a crush on your uncle." Pausing for a moment, he smiled again. "You used to like sticking to me." Cher pulled the lever and glared at him. Mr. Yi also said it was in the past, but it's different now. She emphasized her tone and childishly rolled the suitcase over his feet. Naturally, she did not hurt him. Yi Muyun reached out to hold her hand. She couldn't walk and almost fell. As for him, with just a gentle tug, she fell onto his lap and buried herself in it. "You've grown up, but you still like to throw a tantrum." He chuckled and reached out to rub her soft long hair. "What, you don't dare to stay here anymore? Are you afraid that I'll eat you?" Schwerer snorted. Of course not. He whispered in her ear, if you don't let me touch you, I won't touch you, okay? I don't want to, she said willfully. Yimuyun laughed and pinched her little face. It's only for a few days. Are you afraid that you'll waver and fall in love with me again, okay? Cher looked up at him. You're too arrogant. I'm not? His voice became even softer, as if he was blowing air into her ear. Cher glared at him. He chuckled softly. It's only for a week. Xiaoxin, aren't you the one with the most backbone? He called her by her pet name, which sounded very intimate. His face was extremely handsome, and it was very bewitching. Chapter 2193. She didn't speak, which was a silent agreement. Yimuyun sighed in his heart. This little girl, just like when she was young, couldn't resist provocation and fell for it easily. However, he really couldn't touch her casually anymore. If he did, she would probably explode and make a fuss about going home. Looking at her now, she was so promising. He thought she had grown up, but she was actually still a little kid. As he thought about it, he felt an indescribable warmth in his heart. He wanted to hold her in his arms and kiss her, just like when she was young. However, he didn't dare to act rashly. He had to take it slow. Cher looked at him and pursed her lips. Then, she dumped the suitcase on him and said shamelessly, "Help me pack. I want to sleep." He grabbed her hand and didn't let her run away immediately. He asked very slowly, "Are you sure? I remember that there are some of your private clothes in here." And to her, he was a stranger. He was just reminding her that in her heart, he, Yimuyun, was still very important. She just didn't realize it. She was stunned for a moment, then broke free. Ignoring him, she lay on the bed and covered her head with the blanket. He couldn't help but laugh. Was she angry or throwing a tantrum? Looking at the strand of black hair left on the pillow, he stared at it for a long time. Then, he picked up her suitcase, opened it, and arranged it in the closet. He used to do these things often because she was too young and didn't know how to take care of herself. No matter how busy he was, some of her private clothes were arranged by him. Now that he was doing these things, his heart was indescribably satisfied. Yimuyun smiled helplessly. His large palm gently stroked the lace. In the past, she didn't wear these. She always wore girly underwear and pants because he was the one who picked them out for her. In the past few years, she had fallen in love with these feminine clothes. To be honest, he seemed to have accepted it easily. His Xiaoxin was already 26 years old. She was old enough to be a mother. His gaze softened. Perhaps after a while, after they got married, they could have a child. A little Xiaoxin. Yimuyun packed his things. Looking at his and her entwined in the closet, he felt much happier. When he walked out, his little piggy actually fell asleep. He leaned against her side and freed her little face from the blanket. In a low voice, he murmured, "You're afraid that I'll touch you, so you're sleeping like this again." He could have taken advantage of her, but he didn't want to do so. Pressing his face against hers, he said in a low voice, "Cher, will you listen to me?" She fell asleep and obediently lay in his arms, listening to his heartbeat. After a long time, their heartbeats became one and calmed down. When Cher woke up, it was already 4 o'clock in the afternoon. She and Yimuyun were not the only ones in the suite. She could hear him talking to someone from the living room. It was probably the stylist. Cher sat up and leaned against the headboard. This was obviously Zhou Chongguang's prank. How could he take it seriously? After sitting for a while, Yimuyun came in. "You're awake." She nodded and looked up at him. "Just pick a random dress. I don't want to go through all that trouble." If she really wanted to go through all that trouble, it would take a few hours. She had gotten used to simplicity over the years and didn't like it to be complicated. Chapter 2194. When Cher got up, she suddenly said, "Have you ever thought that perhaps it's not Qin Mu who is helping us, but we who are helping Zhou Chongguang?" Yimuyun's gaze was focused on her. Her gaze was clear and focused. Because she had used the word "we" just now, which strangely comforted him. After a moment, he smiled faintly. "Cher, that's not important. It didn't matter who was helping whom. What was important was that he was with her at this moment." Cher looked at him. She couldn't tell what he was thinking, so she decided not to think about it anymore. When she reached the living room, she was stunned. The two stylists were fine, but what was up with the row of gowns? She was used to seeing the world, so she could tell that those weren't just any ordinary big-name gowns. They were the best of the best. How did he manage to fly dozens of gowns here in such a short time? "Pick one and style it," he said calmly, walking to the floor-to-ceiling window and pushing it open. He stood by the window and smoked, maintaining his standing posture. Cher looked at his handsome side profile and thought to herself, does this count as companionship? She knew what he was thinking, but she could only pretend that she didn't understand. If it wasn't for that incident, she would have thrown herself into his arms without hesitation. So what if she was selfish for once? But she had too many reservations. She couldn't accept him with her status. Her heart sank. When she looked up again, she happened to meet his deep eyes. Actually, she wasn't the only one who had changed over the years. He had changed too. He had become more unfathomable. Just like the collaboration between him and Zhou Chongguang. Cher didn't even dare to think about it in the past. But this time, he really did it. As she thought about it, she was a little distracted as she picked out the gown. She casually picked a long white gown. It looked rather conservative. At least it covered her arms, so she wouldn't be too cold wearing it at night. But when she put it on, she gasped. The back was completely bare, and her creamy back could be seen clearly. Anyone who saw it would want to fantasize. She was in the washroom, meowing like a kitten. Help me change into something else. She didn't want to go out like this. She didn't want others to see her like this. But she cried like a kitten, and no one could hear her. After calling for about 5 times, Yi Muyun walked over and raised his eyebrows. Let me see. Since she refused to come out, he leaned in and closed the bathroom door. If you do this, others will think too much. She pushed him away, her voice soft. Yi Muyun leaned against the door and looked at her quietly. All of a sudden, he reached out and pulled her around. Behind him was boundless spring scenery. He gasped, squinting at her. Cher felt a little uneasy and her body was pressed into his arms again. She moved and her voice was light. Brother. It was because of her hidden fear that she cried out, and she regretted it the moment she cried out. She bit her lip helplessly, not knowing what to do. Yi Muyun's large palm pressed her entire body against his shoulder. His voice was especially hot and even a little coaxing. What did you call me just now, huh? Her little body only knew how to tremble in his arms. She couldn't say a word. Chapter 2195. He bit her little ear and said in a deep voice, Little liar, you obviously haven't forgotten about me. His large palm touched his back. At this moment, he felt that the design of this dress was damn good. It was too convenient, but he couldn't let her wear it outside. Cher was extremely afraid of him acting so recklessly, afraid that he would do something. But how could he stand it when she was dressed like a vixen and called him brother? He lowered his head and kissed her little mouth. At the same time, he tightened his arms and pressed her into his embrace. Cher bit her lip and cried out, You said that you wouldn't touch me. But those words were swallowed by him again and again. It was as though he wanted to swallow her whole. She was afraid and excited at the same time, her nose was filled with his masculine scent. It was intoxicating. She struggled with all her might, but she couldn't break free. He was always aware of her body's weakness. Not only did he not let her escape, but he also ignited her little flame. The kiss became more and more seductive. He didn't kiss deeply, but he succeeded in seducing her. That feeling of wanting it but not being able to do it completely drove Cher crazy. She tiptoed and wanted to touch his lips, but he moved away. After a few missed kisses, the little guy got angry and wanted to push him away. But at this moment, he chuckled and took her little mouth, gently giving her what she wanted. Their lips and teeth intertwined as they challenged each other again and again. Her little heart was beating extremely fast. At this moment, she forgot about everything. She forgot that she had no choice but to kiss him based on her instinct. There were always people outside. So he had to be careful about what he wanted to do. Finally, the kiss ended. When it ended, Cher's little hand was still wrapped around his neck. That tiny bit of tenderness almost drove him crazy. He said hoarsely, Do you like it? Her eyes were still glistening and it was extremely alluring. Looking at her like that, he couldn't help but lower his head and kiss her lightly again. He just couldn't get enough. As he kissed her, he thought of the past 8 years and his heart felt a little wet. She let him kiss her, but she lowered her eyes and her rationality returned bit by bit. In the kiss just now, she was very clear about how much she had invested herself into it and how much she had taken the initiative. So now that she had sobered up, it was clearly not rational for her to slap him. While being kissed by him, Cher was trying to come up with an excuse to escape. She admitted that she had been mesmerized by him just now. She despised herself countless times in her heart. It wasn't like she had never seen a man before. How did she fall for his trick? After a long time, she coughed and said, Can you help me change into a dress? He lowered his head to look at her. She turned her little face to the side, refusing to communicate with him. You can also keep this one. It's quite convenient to wear it at home. His voice was slightly hoarse, and it revealed a dangerous tension. Moreover, his words were filled with dense hints. What a shameless hint. If it was in the past, Cher would have retorted and said that he was shameless. But now, she had learned to be obedient. She would let him do whatever he wanted. She would never try to curry favor with him. She replied with a hum and raised her head. "Help me pick one." He looked at her little face that was flushed red. His heart skipped a beat as he hugged her once more. His voice was even hoarser now. "I really don't want anyone to see you like this. What should I do, baby? I want to lock you up at home." He leaned against her forehead and murmured in a deep voice that was indescribably intimate. She turned her head away and bit down on her lips. "Hurry and go." Chapter 2196. Cher turned her face away and pursed her lips. "Yi Muyun, don't call me that." They were no longer in that kind of relationship. She couldn't take it anymore. Yi Muyun's gaze was burning as he looked at her little face. After a while, he chuckled. "Indeed, you've grown up. You shouldn't call me baby anymore." "Baby? I'm not your baby," she muttered softly before pushing him. "Hurry up and go pick out your clothes." However, he did not move and continued to lock her body in place. Cher glared at him. Yi Muyun chuckled. "Say it. Please, brother." In the past, she would beg him like this whenever he refused to give her anything she wanted. Cher pursed her lips and refused. Yi Muyun did not force her. He kissed her and went out first. After he left, Cher's legs were trembling. It had been 8 years. She still could not control herself when she was with him. Every kiss and gaze from him was enough to stir her up and make her unable to control herself. About 5 minutes later, he walked in again with a short white gown in his hand. "Change into this," he said calmly. Cher took it and pursed her lips. "You go out first." Yi Muyun smiled and went out first. Cher changed into the gown and looked at herself in the mirror. It was a simple design with a knee-length skirt. It was indeed suitable for outdoor dinners. She walked out and matched it with a pair of silver high heels. Finally, the stylist helped her tie her hair up and pinned it with a small diamond. The person in the mirror looked fresh and beautiful. Cher looked at herself. She had to admit that he had good taste and knew what suited her best. His figure appeared in the mirror. He was still wearing a white shirt and black trousers. However, the shirt was not tied at his waist. Even so, it was hard to hide his aura. Yi Muyun stood behind her and looked at the person in the mirror with her. She did not know when a necklace had appeared in his hand. Cher only came back to her senses when she felt a cold sensation on her neck. It was an ice blue diamond necklace. The entire necklace was made up of 108 aqua blue diamonds and 1008 colorless fine diamonds. Wearing it on her neck, it was as if she was wearing an entire ocean on her fair neck. "Brilliant," he said in a low voice. Cher lifted her head and looked at him. "This is too precious." Then she remembered that the necklace had been auctioned off last week and bought by a mysterious buyer. She remembered that it was worth more than $800 million. Yi Muyun's voice was very calm. "It's not valuable if it's suitable for you." With that, he straightened his body and held her hand. "Let's go." Cher stared at him without moving for a long time. His voice was hoarse. "If we're late, it'll be too late." Slowly, she finally placed her hand in his palm. She told herself that this was just a reality show and everything was like an illusion. After a few days, everything would go back to normal. She would return to America, and he would continue to be the president of Boise. He might find a girlfriend like Song Karen. She looked up at his back as she thought about it, and tears welled up in her eyes. Yi Muyun held her little hand all the way out of the hotel. Chapter 2197. The hotel had a large central garden, which was very suitable for holding a banquet. Behind it was a magnificent building that was lit up in the night, and in front of it was a vast ocean, mysterious and unfathomable. The two completely different feelings mixed together, and it was especially artistic. At this moment, the huge fountain in the garden of the open-air party was opened. Unlike other places, the water that gushed out was light blue and glowed faintly. The statue of the saintess in the middle seemed to be smiling under the music. Yi Muyun held Cher's hand as they walked through the party. She was surprised to find that there were so many celebrities tonight. Although she was born into a good family, it was still a little strange to see so many celebrities at once. "I'm in charge of King Entertainment for the time being," Yi Muyun explained calmly. "Oh," Cher replied and didn't ask any more questions. Actually, she knew that he had already become the vice president of Boise at Chin Mo's age. That kind of hardship was something she couldn't imagine. So she looked up and took a few more glances at him. Yi Muyun pulled her hand closer and let her hold it. She didn't refuse because the theme of the night was this kind of double party. There was no reason for her to embarrass him on such an occasion. Her slender fingers grasped his arm and felt his muscles bulge. Was he nervous? She couldn't help but look up at him again. Tang Cher, if you keep looking at me like this, we'll probably be in the newspapers tomorrow. The headline is not something you want to see. His voice was calm and there was a hint of a smile in it. Cher pursed her lips and didn't say anything else. He smiled and walked over to greet familiar people. Cher realized that it wasn't just celebrities. There were also many people in the business world. Most of them were young, so she hadn't noticed it just now. She quickly realized that this was a business gathering. It was very likely that he already had a schedule, so he took part in a reality show along the way. Now, she finally understood why he was so free. Thinking of this, the guilt in her heart lessened a little. Yi Muyun handed her a glass of cocktail and smiled faintly. What are you thinking about? Cher looked around for a while before returning her gaze to his face. She pursed her lips and said, I want to know the relationship between these people. Her heart was beating fast and her face was hot. She cared about this. She didn't want him to be the kind of person who would sacrifice his female celebrities for his own interests. Whether they were together or not, she hoped that he was respectful to women. Or rather, in her heart, he had always been lofty. Yi Muyun smiled faintly. Cher, why do you care so much? Do you care about their circumstances, or do you care about what kind of person I am? She shook her head slightly. He was too powerful and understood her too well. Nothing about her could be hidden from him. In front of someone as powerful as Yi Muyun, she was almost transparent. She hesitated for a moment before saying, You clearly know. His smile deepened, and he gently touched his glass with hers. I'll tell you after you drink this glass of wine. She looked at him with tears in her eyes. Ever since they were young, he had always bullied her like this. She refused to drink it and said a little angrily, It has nothing to do with me anyway. After saying that, she turned her face away. He looked at her side profile, and his smile deepened. Chapter 2198. His fingers gently pinched her soft little face. It had been 8 years and she was still as soft as before. Moreover, there was a milky scent on her body. On such a night, he couldn't help but pull her into his arms. She was so petite and it was just right for him to place her in his arms. He kissed her forehead and said hoarsely, You're already so big and there's still a milky scent on your body. He closed his eyes and rubbed his face against her hair. Smelling like this, I feel like I'm hugging a child. She couldn't break free. Moreover, she had to give him face in such an occasion. She lay on his shoulder and said in a low voice, But you smell like a stinky man. He chuckled and nibbled her behind the ear. Cher whined, You're a dog. There were so many people around and they could be photographed at any time. In fact, their kiss had already been photographed and it was a beautiful scene. Cher struggled a little but couldn't break free. She said softly, Let go of me. He used more force and hugged her in his arms. One of his large palms was getting a little unruly. Cher's face was a little red. Yi Muyun, there are so many people watching. He was already dancing with her in his arms. Even though his actions weren't easy to be seen, she still felt pressured in front of so many people. Look around. His thin lips were near her ear and he said in a low voice, Haven't you been to such an occasion before? Cher was a little suspicious. She turned her head and saw that everyone was hugging each other just like them. She dared to say that these people weren't all couples or lovers. She was stunned. His thin lips were near her ear and he said softly, This is Hai Tianqing Yen. Cher looked especially surprised as she looked up and stared at him. At this moment, her expression was really cute. Her eyes were wide open and her mouth was in an O shape. She was just short of 2 pointy ears. As he watched, he felt an indescribable satisfaction in his heart. He laughed and scolded, Idiot. Where's your brains gone all these years, eh? He said, kissing her ear passionately. Cher couldn't avoid it and said angrily, I don't want to join. She had always been pure, so she didn't want to participate in such a bad gathering. Furthermore, it was supposed to be a reality show. How did it end up in a place like this? She struggled, and he had no choice but to hold her little body in place. Very softly, he said, It's organized by Zhou Chongguang. He has been organizing it for 4 years. Cher was stunned. Then, she gritted her teeth. You didn't even do anything about it. All these years, he's been messing around. Are you just going to watch him let Qin Mu down? Then what about me leaving back then? After she finished speaking, he did not reply, and she herself was a little regretful. She seemed to have said something that she shouldn't have, because with their current relationship, what she said was a little too deep. After a long time, he hugged her slender waist with one hand and cupped her little face with the other, forcing her to lift him up. Cher pursed her lips, looking a little stubborn, looking as though she didn't want to communicate with him anymore. He knew that the reason why she could say so much was probably because she had a little more alcohol. Chapter 2199. Cher looked at him helplessly, not understanding what he was trying to do. But then, he bent down and kissed her little mouth. After a long kiss, he fed her all the wine. Tears welled up in her eyes. Because the alcohol level was a little high, it was spicy and uncomfortable to hold in her mouth. But he had the intention to make her drunk. He fed her mouthful after mouthful. After one glass of alcohol, she was already slightly tipsy. In fact, she could hold her liquor well, but with his kiss, she became the most intoxicating thing in the world. Her body began to grow hot and weak, and she lay limp in his arms, unable to move for a moment. Yi Muyun's voice was low. "Do you want more?" She shook her head. Her legs were a little weak, and she could only hang her slender arms around his neck, leaning on his body to support herself. She knew that he wanted to make her drunk, but she couldn't resist. After drinking too much, she became a little crazy. She opened her mouth and bit hard on his shoulder. He was only wearing a shirt. She easily bit him, and very soon, she tasted the sweetness of blood. Yi Muyun let go of her, treating her like a child. Cher finally let go of him. She looked at the faint pink stain on his white shirt. He was bleeding. "Does it hurt?" she asked him softly. Her eyes were like the brightest stars in the sky. Only when she was drunk would she dare to be so concerned about him, and only then would she dare to mess around so openly. Perhaps she had been more repressed than he had in the past 8 years. Yi Muyun kept looking at her and smiled faintly. "You can help me." As soon as he finished speaking, the little kitten lowered its head and licked his wound very gently and softly. She looked especially focused, as if she had a lifetime to do so. At this moment, there was no one else. In the entire universe, only Yi Muyun and Tang Cher were left. His voice was gentle. "Cher, these are both consensual. There is too much darkness in this world and I can't stop it." He paused for a moment before continuing. "As for Zhou Chongguang, I used to hope that he would be as bad as possible, so that Qin Mu would come to her senses. But looking at them now, I'm a little hesitant. I wasn't a hesitant person before." Perhaps it was because of their reunion that his heart softened a little. Perhaps it was because of her that he had allowed Zhou Chongguang to do whatever he wanted all these years. He was so conflicted that he didn't even know what he really thought. Cher pursed her lips and looked up at him with a dazed expression. "Actually, you don't have to explain to me." "Then who am I going to explain to?" He said somewhat mischievously, "My girlfriend left because of you." Cher was originally treating his wound. Now that she was angry, she bit him again. "It's obvious that you're the irresponsible one." He smiled bitterly and lowered his head, pressing his face against hers. "In this world, I only want to be responsible for one person." Cher didn't say anything. She was drunk and knew that she couldn't answer him. After a long pause, he looked at her. Actually, Song Ku is not a bad person." She said very slowly, "Do you want to consider getting her back?" As soon as she finished speaking, her little mouth was kissed. Chapter 2200. In the end, her back hit a wall. The cold wall woke her up temporarily. She opened her eyes and looked at his slightly twisted face. He was angry. Was it because she said Song Karen? He was the girlfriend he found himself. Why was he angry now? She bit him unceremoniously. He retreated in pain, but his fingers were still holding onto her shoulder, unwilling to let go. Cher's heart was heaving up and down. She pursed her lips and glared at him. Then, a slap was thrown over. The atmosphere was a little tense. He hadn't expected her to hit him in such a situation. What gave her the courage to do so all these years? Yi Muyun's face was very ugly, but he just glared at her and didn't do anything to her. "I'm not the little girl from before. You can't kiss me whenever you want." Her voice was a little cold. "Also, between you and Song Karen, it has nothing to do with me." He said that he didn't touch her, so there must be something between them. She wouldn't take the blame for breaking up. Yi Muyun kept looking at her. Then, he chuckled and leaned against the side. Angry. He knew what she was thinking. She still cared about him finding a girlfriend. Although she said that she didn't care, her anger was all because of that slap just now. "I'm not angry." She bit her lip. "I want to go back to the room. Accompany me to the dinner party or go back to the room to make love. You choose." He once again pressed her little face into his embrace and shamelessly pressed his lips against her little neck, kindly giving her a choice. Cher was a little annoyed. Is there a difference? Looking at him now, he wouldn't let her off even after the dinner party. Just like now, his body was already expressing it. Yi Muyun smiled. It was a very satisfied smile. Good girl. Then, he held her hand and walked to the center of the party again, giving her a reprieve. He fed her a lot of alcohol until she was drunk. He was actually shocked. In the past, Cher didn't have much alcohol tolerance, but now she could drink a few glasses of strong alcohol. Although he couldn't bear to do it, he made up his mind to force her to do it. He always had a plan in mind. He knew in his heart that she wouldn't easily stay, so a child was the best, fastest, and most direct method. In the past, he always felt that she was still young and that he had to wait a few years. Now, he somewhat regretted it. If they had killed each other at that time, perhaps they would not have been separated for these 8 years. Qin Mu and Zhou Chongguang stood far away. Qin Mu looked worried. She tilted her head and looked at Zhou Chongguang. Brother, you seem to have made Cher drink a lot. Are you sure you're okay? Zhou Chongguang stared into the distance for a long time before he retracted his gaze and smiled faintly. Your brother would never hurt her. Zhou Chongguang was a man, and he knew how men thought. Yi Muyun was probably thinking the same thing as him. He wanted to use a child to tie down Tang Cher, and he wanted Qin Mu to conceive a child. His mentality had changed. At this moment, he thought that it didn't seem so hard to stay with a woman for the rest of his life. If Tang Cher was a sad dream of his youth, then Qin Mu was a cup of tea in his life. Chapter 2201. Now, he thought that she hadn't been pregnant all these years because she had been deliberately using contraception, but he hadn't noticed it. It was him who had neglected her. She had wanted to leave him a long time ago, but she hadn't found a breaking point, so it had dragged on until now. In other words, she hadn't been happy at all in the past 8 years. This was a big blow to a man like Zhou Chongguang. At this time, Yi Muyun had already taken Cher away. Qin Mu's fingers clenched Zhou Chongguang's arm and she said nervously, "Will something happen?" Zhou Chongguang couldn't help laughing. He looked down at his little wife and said helplessly, "Mu, do you want them to reconcile or not?" Then, he said something about a man's opinion. In fact, sometimes feelings are formed through sleeping. Really? Then did you, Gu Mei, Lin Shui, Zhao Shui, and Li Shui fall in love with each other? Qin Mu sneered. Zhou Chongguang touched his nose and knew that he had poked a hornet's nest. He chuckled and looked at her. But the one I slept with the most is Mrs. Zhou. He immediately added, in the future, only you. He reached out and hugged her, smelling her pleasant smell. Qin Mu had a faint smell of chrysanthemum on her body. Maybe it was the smell of the shower gel she liked to use. She rarely used perfume, but this smell was even better than perfume. He had never thought that he would be infatuated with his wife. The excitement of these nights was not only because he wanted to keep her, but also because he was really attached to her body. He had long passed the age of a young man, and he couldn't even count the number of women he had slept with. But recently, he couldn't restrain himself at all. He always pressed her down several times, every night. Of course, Qin Mu didn't want to, but she couldn't struggle, so she had to comply. She just didn't want to give him a reaction. Zhou Chongguang had a man's bad habit. The more she was unwilling, the more he forced her. Under all kinds of torture, she would always surrender and even beg him. After a long time, he began to enjoy it. Every time he teased her like this, he felt an indescribable satisfaction in his heart. This was an extreme feeling that surpassed the physical body. He felt that he had already become addicted to it. Zhou Chongguang would sometimes lament that he had wasted 8 years and lost so much fun. He even thought, if before she turned 18, just like that, would she cry a lot? He couldn't think about it. Just thinking about it made his blood boil. Even he himself felt that he was a pervert. However, Qin Mu didn't know any of this. He did not dare to let her know. He only showed that he was willing to let her know. As for infatuation, it was fine as long as he knew. He was a man who liked to take things slow. Therefore, during this period of time, the women outside were not attractive to him at all. As he said that, Qin Mu glared at him with a meaningful look. "You're a pervert." He smiled helplessly and put his hand in his pocket. "Mrs. Zhou, would you like to dance with a pervert?" Yi Muyun left. This place still needed someone to hold up. Qin Mu looked at him suspiciously, but she still danced with him. She didn't really care anymore. If he wanted to do it at night, she wouldn't reject him too much. She would just treat it as if she was bitten by a dog. Moreover, she would treat him as a free gigolo. Anyway, the divorce was still going to happen. In Qin Mu's heart, he thought happily. Chapter 2202. However, Zhou Chongguang didn't think so. In his eyes, Qin Mu was just a harmless little sheep with weak resistance. She must feel that it didn't matter that she had slept with him for nothing, right? But after so many years of being husband and wife, she didn't know that he, Zhou Chongguang, never did useless things. He had spent so much effort on her, and he wouldn't accept the result of their separation. His little Mumu didn't know that. Qin Mu put her hand in his palm and slid onto the dance floor with his strength. This was the first time the couple had appeared in public. Zhou Chongguang danced very well. Being led by him, Qin Mu silently wondered which woman had taught him his dancing skills. However, she could only think about it and could only smile bitterly. She didn't need to care too much about a man who didn't belong to her. Qin Mu spun in his arms and smelled the fragrance on his body. She was a little drunk. The blue night sky and the stars were shining. Dancing under such a sky was the most romantic thing, but everything now was unreal. Qin Mu's voice was very low. Zhou Chongguang, we've never been real, have we? He suddenly hugged Qin Mu tightly, closed his eyes and said in a slightly pained voice, No, Mumu. When I hugged you, it was real, and it's real now. He tightened his arms, letting her feel his strength and his emotions. Do you feel it now? Qin Mu buried her face in his arms and said softly, Zhou Chongguang, it's a little too late. He gently stroked her long hair and said in a hoarse voice, Mumu, we're still young. It won't be too late. He pressed his face against her little face, which was an intimate gesture that he had never done before. It was as if he was laying himself out in front of her, but he didn't care at all. He had never been so eager to share everything with his wife. He pressed his forehead against hers and said in a low voice, Mumu, are you willing? His fingers slowly circled around her small palm and became tightly intertwined. This gesture made Qin Mu a little resistant. She pursed her lips and said, No. Why not? His voice was hoarse. Mumu, are you afraid? At the end of his sentence, his own voice sounded a little light. How could Qin Mu stand him like this? When they were together, he was always gentle to her. At that time, she thought they were in love, but in fact, she was just hot-headed. But when a man like Zhou Chongguang deliberately released his charm to you, it was hard for a girl like Qin Mu to resist. Qin Mu desperately shook her head, but she couldn't win against him. He kept holding on to her and teased her naughtily. How could she be his opponent? She was easily defeated. Her slender body was trembling slightly in his arms. Zhou Chongguang lowered his head and looked at his little wife in his arms. She was very beautiful tonight. She was wearing an ice blue dress that accentuated her figure. There was a sapphire called the Heart of the Ocean on her neck. From his direction, he could faintly see some spring scenery. At this moment, he couldn't hold back anymore. He regretted it. He should have taken her away earlier instead of staying here to support her. Chapter 2203. Qin Mu raised her eyes and looked at him eagerly. After a long while, she resisted weakly and said, No. But Mumu. I want. His voice was hoarse and sexy. He clasped her fingers and began to kiss her lightly. It was a very light kiss, like a spring breeze. Qin Mu pursed her lips tightly, afraid that he would kiss her deeply. She was very nervous. She had been a very orthodox girl since she was a child, and she had never been so intimate with anyone outside. His words also made her blush, so she turned her face away uncomfortably. Zhou Chongguang's eyes were a little deep. His thin lips covered her ear and he said in a low voice, Mumu, you don't know how charming you are. Zhou Chongguang. She pursed her lips and glared at him. Zhou Chongguang chuckled and reached out to touch her little face again. Little fool. She lowered her head and said weakly, Don't do this. What do you mean? You're charming, or I want you, huh? He teased her and bullied her to his heart's content. Qin Mu could only raise her eyes and try her best to stare at him. He was extremely happy and felt that his little wife was really cute. He reached out to rub her and said in a particularly seductive voice, Fool. He grabbed her and suddenly carried her in his arms. There were cheers all around, and Qin Mu screamed, but her screams were drowned out. She could only hit him and struggle desperately. Zhou Chongguang, what are you doing? He hugged her effortlessly and said in a hot voice, I just want to fuck you. He had never said such rough words to her before. He couldn't bear to say it to her. But now that he had said it to her, her reaction made him feel excited. He had never felt this way before. It was as if he had never done it with her before, and he couldn't wait to fuck her. Clearly, they had already done it countless times, but now he wanted to please her, thoroughly please her, make her happy, make her feel that this was a wonderful thing. It must be said that Zhou Chongguang was quite shameless in recent years. He was addicted to alcohol and women, and he was especially good with women. However, he had never waited on a woman before, so he didn't need to. Qin Mu became the subject of his experiment. For the whole night, Qin Mu's life was worse than death. Did he know how to do it? Why was he always torturing her like this? Also, doesn't he find it dirty? However, Zhou Chongguang was so excited that he couldn't stop. He didn't let her go until 2 in the morning. Qin Mu was too tired to argue with him. She fell asleep as soon as she closed her eyes. Zhou Chongguang lay beside her and calmed down for a while. Then he propped himself up and looked at her quietly. She had never experienced anything like this before. She was probably exhausted. He reached out his hand and touched her rosy little face, smiling faintly. Qin Mu's face had always been a little pale, but after this round, her complexion was surprisingly good. He shamelessly thought that this kind of exercise was good for her too. After looking at her for a long time, he got out of bed and went to the bathroom to get a hot towel. He carefully wiped her clean. As he wiped, his breathing became erratic again, and he was actually a little aroused. Zhou Chongguang secretly scolded himself a few times and focused on cleaning her up. Chapter 2204. He had asked the doctor about the medicine she prescribed. It was a long-term contraceptive pill, and it would not cause much damage to the body. Of course, he had already changed the medicine. Stroking her delicate face with his fingers, he was already looking forward to her giving birth to a cute and awkward little girl like her. He would definitely make up for these 8 years with their child. At that time, she would probably forgive him slowly. After lying flat, Zhou Chongguang didn't feel sleepy. He kept looking at Qin Mu's little face under the dim light. It was as if he couldn't get tired of looking at her. Sometimes people were like this. When they got something, they didn't know how to cherish it. Everything was taken for granted. When they lost it, they suddenly realized that it had become a habit. Fortunately, they hadn't divorced yet. Fortunately, she still had him in her heart. Otherwise, she wouldn't be willing to have a relationship with him. Zhou Chongguang was sure about this. He kept looking at her and didn't fall asleep until dawn. He felt that he had only slept for a short while when he heard the sound of Qin Mu getting up. Her voice was very soft, as if she was afraid of waking him up, but he knew that she didn't care about him, but secretly got up to take the contraceptive pill. She didn't let him know, probably because she didn't want to have a conflict with him. Zhou Chongguang closed his eyes and didn't say anything. After she finished taking the pill, she actually climbed into bed again. The corners of his mouth curled up. She was probably really tired. Qin Mu first lay flat on his back, then he turned around. After a long time, he seemed to turn over inadvertently and hugged her slender waist from behind. His voice was also low and hoarse. Mumu? Her voice was a little light, because his palm had touched something that he shouldn't have touched. The corners of Zhou Chongguang's mouth curled up, and his voice was extremely hoarse. Sleep with me for a while more. With that, he buried his face in her neck. Qin Mu's body was a little stiff. How could she fall asleep with him like this? Her body was stiff and she didn't dare to move. It wasn't until she felt that he didn't mean it that she slowly closed her eyes and fell asleep. When her breathing was even, Zhou Chongguang gently opened his eyes and the corners of his mouth curled up slightly. Their relationship was getting better, but she probably didn't dare to think about Mumu. Burying his face in the pillow, he took a deep breath of her scent and fell asleep. This time, there was only Qin Mu in his world, and no one else. Just as they were sleeping soundly, Guze stood by the sea, still standing at the place where Qin Mu sat last time. He stood there for a whole night, but in fact, he did not leave. He knew that Qin Mu and Zhou Chongguang showed signs of reconciliation. He smiled bitterly. Yes, how could she not be soft-hearted? She used to like Zhou Chongguang so passionately. Once this man expressed his feelings for her, how could she escape? Guze thought bitterly that this was also good. It would save his silly sister from waiting bitterly. Now that they had reconciled, Gume should have given up. It was Zhou Chongguang's order that Gume went abroad, but Guze knew that she had not given up. She was not a person who was greedy for power. If she had given up, she would have left Glory Group directly, but she didn't. Guze thought that he should fly to Paris and have a good talk with Gume. Guze couldn't stay here for a long time, so he went to Yi Muyun's bedroom to say goodbye. However, when he walked to the door, he heard the sound of something breaking inside. It seemed to be a fierce fight. Guze paused, shook his head, and decided not to say goodbye. Chapter 2205. In the suite, Cher was smashing the things in the bedroom into smithereens. When a person was drunk and woke up, they realized that their body was unrecognizable, and there were red kisses all over. When you were standing in front of the mirror in a daze, the instigator still dared to stand behind you. It was hard not to be angry when he shamelessly repeated what happened last night. No matter how much she struggled, it was useless. He just did it shamelessly, and he even used many indescribable methods. Cher recalled that he wasn't like this in the past. Perhaps it was because he was young and inexperienced, and he always used traditional methods. Now, it was simply indescribable. Cher was angry as she smashed the things in the suite. Her face was so red that it seemed like it was dripping blood. Yi Muyun tried his best to hide, but he couldn't avoid it. He looked at her, his gaze a little indifferent. Cher, can you be more rational? Why can't you be more rational when you're crazy? She said angrily. How do you expect me to go out and meet people? Yi Muyun touched the wound on his forehead. It was bleeding, but her face was not red, and her heart was not beating. How heartless. He looked at her with a burning gaze. We're staying in the same room. Unless I'm a eunuch, I won't touch you. Why do you care about this? Cher was furious. Was he still in the right? So she gritted her teeth. Are you willing to let me do it all over your neck? He looked at her good-naturedly. If you're happy, I don't mind. Shui glared at him. He was really shameless. So she didn't stand on ceremony. She directly pounced on him and bit his neck. She couldn't do it warmly, so she bit him like a little puppy. Yi Muyun's heart was warm. He called the little puppy softly, and the little puppy bit him even more happily. She wanted to bite him to death. Shameless and shameless. As they bit, the taste changed. After all, they were only wearing bathrobes. It was hard not to have sparks when they hugged each other. By the time Cher realized the danger, it was already too late. Her body was lifted off the ground and placed on the countertop. Her back was pressed against the cold surface of the mirror. Yi Muyun. She screamed in fear. She reached out and hugged his neck, not letting him touch her. Even now, her legs were still sore. Call me brother, and I won't touch you. He coaxed her and kissed her hair. Her whole body was refreshing, with a milky fragrance, a smell that he yearned for. Cher refused, so she hugged him and didn't let him have a chance to move. Weren't you very powerful just now, huh? His voice was a little malicious. Snow hurriedly hugged him tightly and humped softly. I apologize. Looks like you've learned to be flexible over the years. Not bad. He chuckled. Call me brother, and I promise I won't touch you. She was really afraid of him. In the end, she had no choice but to cry out softly. Her voice was as soft as a kitten. Brother, I beg you. His eyes were smiling, and he hooked her chin with his fingers. Be good. Tell me what you're begging me for. Her softness after she was drunk was like the strongest medicine that touched his heart. Cher looked at him. Her eyes were watery, but she was cursing in her heart. She was begging him? Begging him. You're tuning into the Dreamy Chapters YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.